At 10:22 in the morning on June 4, 1942, 37 American dive bombers plunged from 14,500 feet toward 3 Japanese aircraft carriers steaming through the Pacific Northwest of Midway Atoll. The carriers below were the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Their hangar decks were crammed with armed aircraft, loose torpedoes, bombs stacked along bulkheads, and aviation fuel hoses snaking across every surface. In approximately 5 minutes, those 3 carriers would be transformed from the most feared striking force on Earth into drifting infernos. The pilots in those American Dauntless dive bombers could not have known it as they pushed over into their screaming dives, but they were about to change the course of the entire Pacific War. Fishermen on distant atolls would later speak of columns of black smoke rising on the horizon. Sailors on escort vessels watched in stunned silence as explosions rippled across flight decks that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier. This was the Battle of Midway, and in those 5 minutes, an empire's dream of Pacific domination died. The 4 carriers that steamed toward Midway that June morning represented the absolute elite of Japanese naval aviation. They were the Kido Butai, the mobile striking force, the same carriers that had devastated Pearl Harbor, that had raided Darwin, that had swept through the Indian Ocean sinking British warships with impunity. No naval force in history had compiled such a record of destruction in so short a time. Their aircraft had sunk or damaged 8 American battleships on December 7, 1941. They had raided Ceylon and sent the British carrier Hermes and cruisers Dorsetshire and Cornwall to the bottom. Wherever the Kido Butai appeared, the enemy died. And now they were coming for Midway. At the heart of this force was Akagi, the Red Castle. She was Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's flagship, a converted Amagi-class battlecruiser displacing 36,500 tons. Akagi stretched 855 feet from bow to stern, capable of 31 knots, carrying approximately 60 aircraft at Midway. Her distinctive port-side island made her instantly recognizable to any naval aviator in the Pacific. Captain Taijiro Aoki commanded a crew of approximately 1,630 men. Akagi had been the flagship for every major Japanese carrier operation since the war began. Beside her sailed Kaga, whose name meant abundant joy. Kaga was the heaviest carrier in the force, converted from a Tosa-class battleship, displacing 38,200 tons. She was slower than her sisters at 28 knots, but she carried the largest air group of any Japanese carrier, 74 aircraft including 27 Zero fighters, 20 Val dive bombers, and 27 Kate torpedo bombers. Captain Jisaku Okada commanded a crew of 1,708 men. Kaga had been with Akagi at Pearl Harbor, at Rabaul, at Darwin, at every triumph the Kido Butai had achieved. The 2 smaller carriers were Soryu and Hiryu, the Blue Dragon and the Flying Dragon. Soryu was purpose-built for speed, displacing 15,900 tons, but capable of an astonishing 34.5 knots, making her among the fastest carriers afloat. She carried 57 aircraft under Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto with a crew of 1,100 men. Her near sister Hiryu was slightly larger, at approximately 17,300 long tons, equally fast at 34.3 knots. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding the 2nd Carrier Division, flew his flag aboard Hiryu under Captain Tomeo Kaku. Together, these 4 carriers embarked approximately 248 aircraft and represented 2/3 of Japan's total fleet carrier strength. They had never been defeated. Their pilots were the most experienced in the world, and they were sailing into an ambush. The American victory at Midway was born not on the deck of an aircraft carrier but in a freezing basement at Pearl Harbor. The space was known simply as the Dungeon. There, Commander Joseph Rochefort led Station Hypo's Combat Intelligence Unit in a desperate race against time. Rochefort was brilliant and eccentric, perpetually unwashed, wearing carpet slippers and a smoking jacket as he worked around the clock. His team of roughly 100 officers and enlisted men included bandsmen recruited from the sunken battleship California for their mathematical aptitude. They were attempting to crack fragments of JN-25B, the Imperial Japanese Navy's primary operational code. JN-25B was a super-Enciphered system using a codebook of approximately 33,000 to 45,000 5-digit groups, overlaid with a separate additive table of 50,000 random numbers. It was considered unbreakable. By spring of 1942, Rochefort's cryptanalysts, led by Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer, could intercept, partially decrypt, and translate roughly 140 Japanese messages per day. It was enough to piece together the outlines of a massive operation. They identified the target as AF, a geographic designator that Rochefort was convinced meant Midway. But Washington's rival code-breaking unit, OP-20G, disagreed sharply. They insisted the target was the Aleutians, or Port Moresby, or even the American West Coast. To settle the argument, Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes devised a deception that would become legendary. Knowing that Midway's garrison depended on seawater evaporators for fresh water, Holmes proposed having Midway broadcast an uncoded emergency message reporting that their distillation plant had broken down. The message was sent via a secure undersea cable laid in 1903. Midway then transmitted the fake distress call in plain language around May 19th or 20th. Within 48 hours, Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese intelligence report stating that AF was short of water. The trap was confirmed. Admiral Chester Nimitz, trusting Rochefort over Washington's skepticism, ordered his 3 available carriers to an ambush point northeast of Midway designated Point Luck. The intelligence picture was remarkably precise. On May 27th, Nimitz's intelligence officer, Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, predicted the Japanese carriers would appear at bearing 325 degrees, distance 175 miles from Midway, at 0600 hours on June 4th. The actual first sighting by PBY pilot Lieutenant Howard Adey came at bearing 320 degrees, distance 180 miles, at approximately 0600 hours. Nimitz later told Layton he had been only 5 degrees, 5 miles and 5 minutes off. Rochefort's team also correctly identified 4 carriers in the strike force, predicted the approximate attack date, knew the approach would come from the northwest, and assessed that the damaged Shokaku and depleted Zuikaku from the Coral Sea battle would not participate. As General George Marshall later stated, without codebreaking, the American forces would have been 3,000 miles out of place. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's Operation M. I was breathtaking in ambition and fatally flawed in design. The plan aimed to seize Midway, extend Japan's defensive perimeter 1,200 miles eastward, and lure America's remaining carriers into a decisive engagement where overwhelming Japanese naval power would annihilate them. The Doolittle raid of April 18, 1942, which struck Tokyo itself, gave Yamamoto the political leverage to push the operation past a skeptical naval general staff. American bombers over the imperial capital was an unacceptable humiliation. Midway would ensure it never happened again. The plan divided the combined fleet into multiple widely separated forces. Vice Admiral Nagumo's first carrier striking force would approach from the northwest to pound Midway with airstrikes. A separate occupation force carrying 5,200 troops would seize the island. Yamamoto himself, aboard the super battleship Yamato, trailed 300 to 600 miles behind with additional battleships as a reserve. A concurrent operation against the Aleutian Islands was meant to proceed simultaneously as a diversion. The plan contained structural weaknesses that no amount of force could overcome. Excessive dispersion meant Yamamoto's powerful main body could provide no support to Nagumo if something went wrong. The Aleutian operation stripped away 2 light carriers that could have reinforced the Midway strike. Japanese intelligence assumed both Lexington and Yorktown had been sunk at the Battle of the Coral Sea. Only Lexington was actually lost. The submarine picket line assigned to detect American ships departing Pearl Harbor arrived late, after the American carriers had already passed through. And in pre-battle war games aboard Yamato, the officer playing the American side did exactly what Nimitz actually did, with catastrophic results for Japan. But the umpire ruled his actions impossible and resurrected Japan's losses. The plan required the enemy to cooperate. The enemy did not. Against the 4 Japanese carriers, the Americans fielded 3 of their own. USS Enterprise and USS Hornet formed Task Force 16 under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, who had replaced the hospitalized Vice Admiral William Halsey just days before sailing. Halsey was suffering from a severe skin condition and could not command. His recommendation of Spruance, a cruiser admiral with no carrier experience, surprised many. It would prove to be one of the most consequential personnel decisions of the war. USS Yorktown led Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who held overall tactical command. Yorktown's presence was itself a miracle of American determination. She had been damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea on May 8th by an armor-piercing bomb that penetrated 5 decks and by near misses that opened hull seams below the waterline. Initial estimates suggested she would need 90 days of repair at Puget Sound Naval Yard. Instead, Nimitz personally inspected her on May 28th and declared that they must have this ship back in 3 days. 1,400 shipyard workers labored around the clock at Pearl Harbor, welding damaged plating together rather than properly riveting it, waiving safety rules to skip fuel tank purging. Yorktown sailed on May 30th, just 48 hours after entering dry dock. Her air group was augmented with squadrons from USS Saratoga. Japanese pilots who encountered her at Midway would be so stunned they assumed she was a different, undamaged carrier. At 0430 hours local time on June 4th, Nagumo launched his first strike against Midway. 108 aircraft lifted from the 4 carriers, 36 VAL dive bombers from Akagi and Kaga, 36 Kate-level bombers from Hiryu and Soryu, 36 Zero escorts to protect them. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga from Hiryu led the strike. Simultaneously, 7 scout planes launched from cruisers and carriers to search for any American naval forces that might be lurking nearby. Critically, Tone's No. 4 floatplane was delayed approximately 30 minutes by catapult problems. This was the scout that would eventually discover the American fleet. That 30-minute delay would prove catastrophic. Per Yamamoto's orders, Nagumo kept his reserve strike force armed for anti-ship warfare. Kate torpedo bombers on Akagi and Kaga were loaded with Type 91 torpedoes. VAL dive bombers on Hiryu and Soryu were held for arming on the flight deck. Half the striking power was ready to attack enemy ships the moment they were discovered. The first strike hit Midway between 0620 and 0630, destroying buildings and fuel storage, but failing to knock out the runways. Marine fighters from VMF 2-21 intercepted the incoming strike, but were hopelessly outclassed. 14 of 25 Marine pilots were killed. Their Brewster Buffalo fighters were no match for the agile Zeros. At 0700 hours, Tomonaga radioed back to the fleet. There is need for a second attack wave. The runways were still operational. Midway's defenses remained intact. Nagumo faced his first fateful decision. No American ships had been reported after 2.5 hours of scouting. Midway-based aircraft were already attacking his fleet in uncoordinated waves. 6 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers attacked, and 5 were destroyed. 4 B-26 Marauder bombers attacked, and 2 were destroyed, with 1 nearly crashing into Akagi's bridge. Marine dive bombers attacked. 17 heavy bombers attacked from high altitude. All failed to score hits, but all forced constant evasive maneuvering that disrupted flight operations. At 0715, Nagumo made the decision that would seal his fate. He ordered his reserve planes rearmed with land attack ordnance. The torpedoes would be removed from the Kate bombers and replaced with 800-kilogram fragmentation bombs for a second strike on Midway. This violated Yamamoto's standing order to maintain half the torpedo planes armed for anti-ship strikes at all times. But Nagumo saw no American ships. Midway needed to be neutralized. The rearming began. The process was agonizingly slow. Only 6 planes could be serviced simultaneously per carrier, with torpedoes lowered by hand, crank onto carts and wheeled away. The bombs had to be brought up from the magazines and attached to the aircraft. Crucially, the removed torpedoes were not returned to the armored magazines below. They were pushed to the bulkheads and placed on holding racks in the hangars. There was simply no time to store them properly. The urgency of the moment demanded speed over safety. Then, at 0728, the delayed Tone No. 4 scout finally reported 10 ships, apparently enemy, sighted. The rearming had been underway for roughly 30 minutes. Approximately half the aircraft had been converted from torpedoes to bombs. At 0745, Nagumo ordered the rearming suspended, but the damage was already done. The hangars were filled with half-armed aircraft, some carrying torpedoes, some carrying bombs, some carrying neither. And then at 0820 came the devastating update from the scout plane. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be an aircraft carrier. Nagumo now faced an impossible dilemma. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi on Hiryu urged an immediate strike with whatever was ready. "Launch now," he signaled. Attack immediately with all available aircraft. Nagumo refused. He chose instead to recover Tomonaga's returning Midway strike, planes that were running low on fuel and could not wait. Then he would prepare a single coordinated counterstrike against the American carriers. This was consistent with Japanese doctrine, which emphasized massed strikes over piecemeal attacks. He estimated readiness by 10, 30, or 1100 hours. The physical state of the hangar decks was now catastrophic. Armed and fueled aircraft filled the enclosed hangar spaces. Torpedoes removed during the 0715 rearming lay on holding racks along the bulkheads. Bombs that had replaced them sat alongside. Fuel hoses snaked across decks from hasty refueling operations. Aviation gasoline vapors accumulated in poorly ventilated spaces. And the Japanese had never been given the uninterrupted 45-minute window needed to spot their strike aircraft on the flight decks. Every time they tried to begin spotting aircraft, another wave of American attackers forced them to maneuver and delayed operations further. The hangar decks had become floating ammunition dumps. The American carrier strikes launched between 0700 and 0906 in a ragged, uncoordinated sequence. The three carriers launched their air groups at different times, on different headings, with no coordination between them. The squadrons became separated almost immediately. Fighters lost contact with the bombers they were supposed to escort. The strike was a shambles before it even found the enemy, and yet, through chaos and courage, it would produce the most decisive 5 minutes in naval history. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet was the first to find the Japanese. 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers under Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron spotted the Kido Butai at approximately 0920. Waldron had broken formation from Air Group Commander Stanhope Ring, whose strike group was flying on heading 265 degrees, nearly due west, away from the actual Japanese position. Waldron knew Ring was wrong. He had studied the Japanese, learned their tactics, anticipated their movements. He radioed Ring and told him he knew where they were. Then he turned his squadron and flew alone toward the enemy. The TBD Devastator was hopelessly obsolete. Its Mark 13 torpedo required launch from below 50 feet altitude at under 110 knots, at dangerously close range to the target. This demanded a long, slow, straight approach against massed fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Waldron's final words to his men before they launched were seared into the memory of every survivor. "If there is only one plane left to make a final run-in, I want that man to go in and get a hit." All 15 Devastators were shot down. Not a single torpedo found its mark. Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire tore them apart before they could reach launch range. Waldron was last seen standing in his cockpit as his burning plane hit the water. Of 30 men in the squadron, only one survived. Ensign George Gay Jr. was wounded in the left hand and arm, a bullet having passed through his left hand. His rear gunner, radioman Robert Huntington, was already dead, killed by zero fire during the approach. Gay's aircraft was shot to pieces, the controls barely responding, fuel streaming from punctured tanks. He managed to release his torpedo before crashing into the ocean. As his Devastator sank beneath him, Gay inflated his life vest and grabbed a black rubber seat cushion that had floated free of the wreckage. For the next several hours, he hid beneath that cushion among the Japanese fleet, periodically lifting it just enough to watch the battle unfold around him. He saw the Zero fighters swarming overhead. He saw the anti-aircraft guns filling the sky with black bursts, and then he saw the dive bombers arrive. Gay watched the bombs fall on Kaga and Akagi from less than a mile away, saw the explosions erupt, saw the flames begin to spread. He remained in the water until the following day, when a Navy PBY Catalina flying boat spotted him and landed to pick him up. He was the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8's attack, and one of the only men in history to witness a pivotal naval battle from the surface of the ocean itself. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise attacked around 0940. 14 Devastators under Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, who flew despite broken ribs from a recent crash, pressed home their attack without fighter escort. VF-6's Wildcat fighters, assigned to provide cover, had mistakenly followed Torpedo Squadron 8 at higher altitude on a different radio frequency. They arrived over the Japanese fleet but circled uselessly at high altitude, unable to hear the desperate calls for help from the torpedo bombers below. 10 of 14 planes were destroyed, including Lindsay's. No torpedo hits. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown attacked around 1000 hours. 12 Devastators under Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey had the only torpedo squadron with fighter escort, 6 F-4F Wildcats, under Lieutenant Commander John Thack. Thack employed his innovative weave maneuver for the first time in combat, a defensive tactic that allowed pairs of fighters to protect each other against more maneuverable opponents. It was not enough. 10 of 12 Devastators were shot down, including Massey's. No torpedo hits. In total, 35 of 41 torpedo bombers were destroyed without scoring a single hit. The sacrifice appeared futile, but it was anything but. The successive torpedo attacks had achieved something that would change the battle. They had drawn the Japanese combat air patrol of Zero fighters down to sea level. They had kept the Zeros concentrated in the southeast quadrant, defending against low-altitude attackers. And most critically, they had prevented Nagumo from ever achieving the uninterrupted 45-minute window he needed to spot aircraft on his flight decks. Every time the Japanese tried to begin launch preparations, another wave of torpedo bombers forced them to maneuver violently to avoid torpedoes. The Zeros were low, the anti-aircraft guns were pointed down, and the hangar decks were still crammed with armed and fueled aircraft. The Japanese carriers were as vulnerable as they had ever been. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky and 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise had reached their calculated interception point at 0920 and found empty ocean. Nagumo had turned northeast to evade the torpedo attacks. The Japanese fleet was not where it was supposed to be. Fuel was critical. McClusky's bombers were at extreme range, and every minute of additional searching meant more aircraft that would run out of fuel before reaching home. His air group commanders' standing orders were to return if the enemy was not found. McClusky made a different decision. Rather than turning back, he continued northwest, reasoning the Japanese must be north of his position. He was gambling with the lives of his pilots and the fate of his aircraft. At approximately 0955, he spotted a lone ship making flank speed to the northeast. It was the destroyer Arashi, racing to rejoin the fleet after depth charging the American submarine USS Nautilus, which had attempted to attack the Japanese formation earlier that morning. McClusky followed Arashi's wake. 10 minutes later, the wakes of the Japanese fleet appeared on the horizon. By extraordinary coincidence, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's 17 Dauntlesses of VB-3 from Yorktown arrived over the Japanese fleet from the northeast at almost exactly the same moment. Leslie's squadron had launched an hour later than McClusky's, but flew a more direct course calculated by Fletcher's staff based on updated position reports. Leslie himself had accidentally jettisoned his bomb due to an electrical malfunction while arming it en route. But he pressed the attack anyway, leading his squadron down while strafing Soryu's deck with his machine guns. At approximately 10:22 in the morning, the dive bombers struck. The SBD Dauntless was the finest dive bomber in the world at that moment. Unlike the doomed Devastators, the Dauntless was fast, maneuverable, and could approach from high altitude where Zeros rarely patrolled. The pilots had practiced this moment hundreds of times. Push over into a 70-degree dive, hold the target in the telescopic sight, watch the altimeter unwind as the ocean rushes up. Release at approximately 2,500 feet, pull out and escape. The theory was simple. The practice, under fire, with anti-aircraft shells bursting around the aircraft and the knowledge that pulling out too late meant death, required extraordinary nerve. The attack unfolded with devastating speed. McClusky ordered Lieutenant Earl Gallagher's VS-6 to follow him down on the nearer carrier, Kaga. This was a doctrinal error that sent both Enterprise squadrons at the same target. Lieutenant Richard Best, commanding VB-6, recognized the mistake as he began his dive. He pulled out, radioed his wingmen to follow, and redirected his section of just 3 aircraft toward Akagi instead. It was a split-second decision that would determine the fate of Nagumo's flagship. Kaga absorbed the heaviest punishment. Approximately 25 to 28, Dauntlesses hammered her with at least 4 confirmed bomb hits. The first struck the forward elevator. Another penetrated near the island, detonating a fuel truck on the flight deck and killing Captain Okada and virtually the entire bridge staff in a single blast. The captain and his senior officers died without ever issuing an order to respond to the attack. Bombs penetrated to hangar decks crammed with armed, fueled aircraft and the loose ordnance from the aborted rearming. Secondary explosions from an estimated 80,000 pounds of explosives created an unstoppable inferno that raced through the ship. The single firefighting water main was destroyed by one of the first hits. There was no way to fight the fires. Damage control parties tried to organize bucket brigades, but the flames spread too fast. Aviation fuel ran across the hangar deck in burning rivers. Ammunition cooked off in random explosions that killed firefighters where they stood. Men trapped in compartments below the hangar decks pounded on hatches that were already too hot to touch. The screams of the wounded mixed with the roar of flames and the secondary explosions of detonating ordnance. Sailors who escaped onto the flight deck found themselves trapped between walls of fire. Many jumped into the sea rather than burn. The destroyers and cruisers of the escort force moved in as close as they dared, lowering boats and throwing lines to pull survivors from the water. But for hundreds of men, there was no escape. Kaga burned for over 9 hours before sinking at 19:25 that evening. 811 of her crew perished, the highest casualty toll of any carrier at Midway. Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, was struck by the smallest force. Just Best and his 2 wingmen dove on the pride of the Japanese fleet, yet a single bomb proved sufficient. Best's 1,000-pound bomb struck at the aft edge of the midship elevator, penetrated to the upper hangar deck, and exploded among armed and fueled aircraft that were waiting to be spotted on the flight deck. Despite being only one hit, the chain reaction of fires and explosions among the loose ordnance in the hangars proved uncontrollable. The torpedo warheads that had been removed during the rearming and stacked along the bulkheads began to cook off. Fire spread through the hangar spaces with terrifying speed. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the Pearl Harbor strike leader, was aboard Akagi that morning. He had undergone an emergency appendectomy just before the battle, which kept him grounded and unable to fly. During the dive bomber attack, an explosion threw him violently to the deck, breaking both his ankles. He would later describe a terrific fire, bodies all over the place, planes standing tail up, belching livid flames. A near miss, close astern, jammed Akagi's rudder, making it impossible to steer. At 10:46, Nagumo, who initially refused to leave his flagship, was persuaded by his chief of staff, Rear Admiral Kusaka, to transfer his flag to the light cruiser Nagara. Kusaka himself escaped through the bridge windows by rope, badly spraining both ankles and suffering burns. Akagi burned through the night. Admiral Yamamoto, who had once served as her captain years before, reportedly said he must now order with heartfelt regret that she be sunk. Akagi was scuttled by destroyer torpedoes at approximately 0500 hours on June 5th. 267 crew died, the lowest toll of the 4 carriers, as most escaped the relatively localized initial fires before they spread. Almost simultaneously with the attack on Kaga and Akagi, Leslie's VB-3 struck Soryu with 3 direct 1,000-pound bomb hits evenly spaced along the flight deck. The third bomb was catastrophic. It shattered the main steam supply lines, killing all propulsion instantly. Soryu lost power within seconds. Fires erupted through both hangar decks as aviation fuel and ordnance cooked off in a chain reaction of explosions. Captain Yanagimoto ordered all non-essential crew to abandon ship within 30 minutes, but refused every entreaty to leave the bridge himself. Crew members reportedly sent a chief petty officer, a Navy wrestling champion, to physically drag the captain away from his post. Yanagimoto would not go. Surrounded by flames, he was last heard shouting "Banzai" as fire consumed the signal tower. He died at his station, fulfilling what he saw as his duty to the last. Soryu sank at 1913 that evening. 711 of her crew perished, the highest mortality rate relative to complement of any carrier at Midway, roughly 65% of all hands. In approximately 5 to 6 minutes, 3 of the 4 most powerful aircraft carriers in the Imperial Japanese Navy had been mortally wounded. The dive bombers escaped with remarkably light losses. VB-3 lost no aircraft over the target. McClusky's plane took 52 hits from pursuing Zeros as he pulled out of his dive. A bullet passed through his shoulder. He landed on Enterprise with less than 5 gallons of fuel remaining in his tanks. It was close to the most destructive single attack in naval aviation history, and it had taken less time than it takes to brew a pot of coffee. Hiryu survived the initial onslaught because she was positioned to the north, separated from the other three carriers while maneuvering to evade the earlier torpedo attacks from Yorktown's squadron. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi, now the senior carrier commander afloat, immediately ordered counterstrikes against the American fleet. He would not go down without a fight. The first wave launched at approximately 10:50, 18 Val dive bombers and 60 escorts under Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi headed for the American carriers. They found Yorktown around noon. Despite fierce anti-aircraft fire and combat air patrol interception that destroyed 13 of 18 bombers, the Japanese pilots scored 3 bomb hits on the American carrier. The hits blew a hole in the flight deck, extinguished all but one boiler, and started fires throughout the ship. Admiral Fletcher transferred his flag to the cruiser Astoria, handing tactical command to Spruance. But Yorktown's damage control teams performed a near miracle. Working with desperate speed, they patched the flight deck and restored enough boiler power to make 19 knots within an hour. By the time Hiryu's second strike arrived, Yorktown appeared fully operational. The second wave launched at 13:31. 10 Kate torpedo bombers, including one that had escaped from the burning Akagi, and 60 escorts flew toward the American fleet. The strike leader was Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, who had led the morning attack on Midway. His aircraft's port fuel tank had been holed by anti-aircraft fire that morning and could not be repaired in time. Tomonaga knew he did not carry enough fuel to return to the carrier. He flew anyway. Yamaguchi reportedly told him that he would gladly follow him. Tomonaga's Kates scored 2 torpedo hits on Yorktown's port side, knocking out all electrical power and inducing a 23-degree list that threatened to capsize the ship. Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered abandoned ship at 14:55. The crew went over the side in an orderly evacuation, while destroyers moved alongside to rescue them. Tomonaga was shot down during the attack. He never had enough fuel to return anyway. The Japanese, seeing Yorktown apparently operational between the dive bombing and torpedo strikes, believed they had successfully attacked 2 different American carriers. One carrier apparently sunk by bombs, another now torpedoed. This was a morale-boosting but dangerously inaccurate assessment. There were still 2 fully operational American carriers hunting for Hiryu. At approximately 1700 hours, Enterprise dive bombers found her. 24 SBDs, including 14 orphan aircraft from Yorktown's VB-3, whose carrier had been abandoned, attacked the last Japanese carrier. They scored 4 confirmed bomb hits that destroyed the forward flight deck and flung the forward elevator bodily against the island's structure. Lieutenant Richard Best scored one of those hits, making him the only pilot in the battle to bomb 2 enemy carriers in a single day. A malfunctioning caustic soda canister in his aircraft's oxygen rebreather released harmful fumes during the mission, reactivating latent tuberculosis that would end his flying career. But he had already made history. Hiryu burned through the night, her engines dying around midnight as the fires reached critical systems. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi gathered the approximately 800 men still aboard, led them in 3 shouts of banzai toward Tokyo, then ordered all hands to abandon ship. He and Captain Kaku chose to remain. According to survivors, they waved their caps to their departing men with complete composure, showing no fear, no regret, only calm acceptance. Yamaguchi was posthumously promoted to Vice Admiral. Destroyer Makigumo torpedoed Hiryu in the early hours of June 5th to prevent capture, but the carrier stubbornly refused to sink. At 09:12, she finally went down. 35 of her engineering crew, left for dead below decks, survived 2 weeks adrift in a small boat before being rescued by the American Navy. 392 of Hiryu's crew perished, including Yamaguchi, Kaku, and Tomonaga. Yorktown herself refused to die easily. After the abandoned ship order, salvage parties reboarded her on June 5th and 6th. They made remarkable progress, correcting her list and restoring limited systems. It seemed she might be saved, but on the afternoon of June 6th, Japanese submarine I-168 slipped through the destroyer screen and fired a torpedo salvo. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown. One hit the destroyer Hamon alongside, which was providing auxiliary power for the salvage effort. Hamon broke in 2 and sank rapidly, depth charges on her stern exploding as she went down and killing approximately 80 men who had jumped into the water. Yorktown lingered through the night, her crew unable to save her, her fires slowly spreading. She capsized and sank shortly before 0700. On June 7th, 1942. Her total casualties from the battle were 141 killed. The losses Japan suffered at Midway were catastrophic beyond anything that simple numbers can convey. 4 fleet carriers sunk. This represented 2/3 of Japan's total fleet carrier strength in a single battle. The heavy cruiser Mikuma was also destroyed in follow-up attacks on June 6. All 248 carrier aircraft went down with the ships or were shot from the sky. The human cost reached approximately 3,057 dead across the fleet, with carrier casualties alone totaling 2,181. Kaga lost 811. Soryu lost 711. Hiryu lost 392. Akagi lost 267. For decades, historical accounts emphasize that hundreds of irreplaceable veteran pilots perished at Midway. Modern scholarship has revised this assessment. Approximately 110 pilots were killed, 36 aboard the carriers, and 74 in aerial combat. The majority of experienced aircrews actually survived the battle. They would die later in the grinding attrition over Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands during the following year. The truly irreplaceable loss was over 700 aircraft technicians and maintenance specialists killed in the hangar deck infernos. These men possessed skills that were extremely limited in the Japanese Navy. Training replacement pilots was difficult. Training replacement mechanics with years of experience maintaining complex aircraft engines and airframes was nearly impossible. The carrier aircraft maintenance capability Japan lost at Midway could never be fully replaced. The carriers themselves represented the true strategic catastrophe. Japan's pre-war carrier construction programs could not keep pace with losses. The Unryu-class mass production program, based on Hiryu's design, planned 16 ships, but would complete only 3 before war's end. Only one new fleet carrier, Taiho, entered a major fleet action during the rest of the war, and she was sunk by an American submarine in her very first battle at the Philippine Sea in 1944. Japan permanently lost the ability to conduct offensive carrier operations after Midway. Planned invasions of New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa were cancelled. The strategic initiative passed irrevocably to the Americans, who launched their first offensive at Guadalcanal just 2 months after Midway. The Japanese government's response to the disaster was concealment bordering on the pathological. Even before the defeated fleet reached Hashirajima anchorage on June 14th, the Navy and Emperor Hirohito were constructing a cover story. Midway was announced publicly as another smashing victory with 2 American carriers sunk. Only later was it added, almost as an aside, that Kaga and Soryu had also been lost. All 4 carriers were kept on the naval registry for months after their destruction, Akagi and Hiryu listed as unmanned, as if they still existed and might somehow return to service. Wounded sailors were classified as secret patients and placed in isolation wards, quarantined from other patients and their own families to prevent them from telling anyone what had happened. Unwounded survivors were dispersed to remote South Pacific commands as far as possible from anyone they might talk to. Most died in subsequent combat operations. No flag officer or combined fleet staff member was punished for the disaster. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the operation, received the news of each carrier's destruction aboard his flagship Yamato, hundreds of miles from the action, too distant to intervene in any way. He ordered a night surface attack that Spruance wisely avoided by withdrawing eastward, correctly surmising that the Japanese possessed superior night fighting capability. On June 5th, Yamamoto ordered a general retreat. The great decisive battle he had sought had been fought and lost in 5 minutes. Yamamoto would be killed less than a year later, on April 18, 1943, when American P-38 fighters, guided by code-breaking intelligence similar to that which had enabled Midway, shot down his transport aircraft over Bougainville. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who bore the tactical burden of every agonizing decision on June 4th, was relieved of command that evening by Yamamoto's direct order. He would later command the rebuilt carrier force and then land-based forces defending Saipan, where he committed suicide on July 6, 1944, as American forces overran the island. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi is often regarded as the most capable Japanese carrier admiral of the war. His aggressive instinct to launch immediately with whatever was ready, overruled by Nagumo that morning, might have changed the battle's outcome. His decision to go down with Hiryu was consistent with the samurai code, but robbed Japan of one of its finest tactical minds at a moment when such minds were desperately needed. On the American side, Admiral Chester Nimitz directed the battle from Pearl Harbor, his trust in Rochefort's intelligence making the ambush possible. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, in overall tactical command aboard Yorktown, has been historically underappreciated. It was under his command that the first 3 Japanese carriers were destroyed. Historian John Lundstrom has argued that Fletcher handled carrier operations more expertly than any other American admiral of the period. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, whose aggressive early launch decision at extreme range caught the Japanese at their most vulnerable, assumed tactical command after Yorktown was hit and made the prudent decision to withdraw east overnight rather than pursue. This decision was later vindicated when intelligence revealed that Yamamoto had sent powerful surface forces eastward, hoping for a night engagement where Japanese torpedo tactics would have held the advantage. Spruance would go on to command the Fifth Fleet and is widely regarded as the finest naval strategist of the Pacific War. As for Commander Joseph Roquefort, the man whose intelligence work made the victory possible, his reward was bitter irony. 4 months after Midway, he was relieved of command amid bureaucratic infighting with rivals at OP-20G in Washington and reassigned to command a floating dry dock, a humiliation for an officer of his abilities. His Distinguished Service Medal, recommended by Nimitz himself, was blocked by Admiral Ernest King. Recognition came only posthumously. President Ronald Reagan presented the medal to Rochefort's children in May 1986, 44 years after the battle and a decade after his death. The Battle of Midway was won by the intersection of intelligence, brilliance, institutional courage, individual initiative, and sacrifice that bordered on the suicidal. Rochefort's codebreakers provided the knowledge of when and where the Japanese would strike. Nimitz supplied the strategic nerve to trust fragmentary intelligence over Washington's skepticism and risk his last 3 carriers on an ambush. Spruance made the aggressive call to launch at extreme range, gambling that his pilots could find the enemy and still make it home. Waldron's torpedo bombers, and those of Lindsay and Massey after him, drew the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level at the cost of 35 of 41 aircraft, and most of their crews, creating the opening the dive bombers needed. McClusky's logical deduction, following a lone destroyer's wake after his calculated interception point came up empty, led him to the Japanese fleet at the decisive moment. Best's quick thinking in redirecting 3 planes to Akagi when both squadrons dove on Kaga meant a single well-placed bomb could doom the enemy flagship. The Japanese, for their part, were undone not by incompetence but by the collision of a flawed operational concept with an enemy who knew their plan in advance. Nagumo's decisions, rearming, recovering, choosing doctrine over urgency, were defensible by Japanese standards. They were the decisions any competent commander trained in Japanese naval doctrine would have made. But they left his hangar decks loaded with the ingredients for catastrophe at exactly the wrong moment. The carriers were at their most vulnerable precisely when the dive bombers arrived. What changed in those 5 minutes was not merely the balance of carriers in the Pacific. It was the trajectory of the entire war. Japan entered June 4, 1942, as the dominant offensive power in the Pacific. By sunset, that era was over forever. The nation that had struck Pearl Harbor, conquered Southeast Asia, and seemed unstoppable, had lost the instruments of its power projection in a span shorter than it takes to drink a cup of coffee. 3 years of brutal fighting remained in the Pacific, island by bloody island, but after Midway the question was no longer whether Japan could win the war. It was only how long the war would last, and how many would die before it ended. Today, the wrecks of Akagi and Kaga rest on the ocean floor approximately 17,000 feet below the surface, discovered by deep-sea expeditions in October 2019. Soryu and Hiryu have also been located and surveyed. They lie in the darkness of the Pacific, silent monuments to the men who served and died aboard them. Japanese and American alike, young men who went to war believing in their countries, who fought with extraordinary courage regardless of which flag they served under. The sea keeps no enemies. In the depths where the carriers rest, there is only silence and the slow work of time. Every June 4th, ceremonies are held at Pearl Harbor and in Japan to remember what happened northwest of Midway. The veterans who once fought there have almost all passed now, taking their memories with them. But the history remains. The dive bombers screaming down from 14,000 feet, the torpedo planes pressing home their attacks through walls of fire, the explosions rippling across flight decks. the men abandoning burning ships into oil-slicked waters. The moment when everything changed. The Battle of Midway reminds us that history turns on hinges. Sometimes those hinges are years in the making. The accumulation of decisions and preparations and training that position forces at the right place at the right time. Sometimes they are moments, a pilot choosing to follow a destroyer's wake, an officer choosing to redirect 3 aircraft at a different target, a codebreaker insisting that AF means Midway despite what Washington believes. And sometimes they are simply 5 minutes when everything goes right for one side and catastrophically wrong for the other. At 10:22 on the morning of June 4, 1942, dive bombers from 2 American carriers found 4 Japanese carriers at the worst possible moment. Within 5 minutes, 3 were burning. By sunset, all 4 would be doomed. It was the moment that broke Japan's offensive power, that shifted the balance of the Pacific War, that began the long road that would end in Tokyo Bay 3 years later. 5 minutes that changed the world.